Almost there. Come on.
I think I have my ideas done. I just haven't really
Here it
Lost
goes.
one of my notebooks and I'm bummed if it comes back to me.
I misplaced this one from 2014. I just picked it up
Nice.
like a year and a half later.
That's a cool one.
Yeah, right.
Should get that again.
It's weird.
Yeah,
Like,
no,
the
it's
kind of
a,
memories that just resurface and you really have to think
no.
about it. Yeah, no, I thought it was a lot more, but I feel like I don't want to know about it.
Saw that the Reed Studies Association is their theme is science.
And
Music.
yeah, the deadline is like the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not going.
You know?
Can't go. I got turned down for some funding, so we thought it was kind of stay close to home.
From this association.
SIGA, from the
Okay.
Swiss International College Association in UK. They said they had a vigorous debate about it and ended up they didn't have
What's wrong with it?
the resources or the manpower, or however they call it.
But you wait, you play guitar. It's just that you really got it.
Welcome, and I'm glad you're all here today. Part of the reason I'm sitting down is because I'm speaking to a live audience and to a web audience so that they can see me on the camera. You know me, I'm Jared Leising. I'm the coordinator of the Cascadia Poetry MOOC. I'm also the teacher of this literature class, English 211 here at Cascadia College. And today we'll be hearing from 3 Cascadia poets. Then we'll be taking questions from the audience who are you guys, as well as the audience online, if there is anybody watching. They're going to be chatting in, and eventually we'll take some questions from them. When you do ask questions online, specifically, please indicate your name, where you're writing from, and what your question is, and we'll kind of intersperse those with questions from the audience. Now I want to introduce the panelists. They're first going to share some thoughts about innovative poetry at Cascadia, and hopefully share a poem. The literature students have been reading Make It True and have read the panelists' work from there. People online are reading other work currently, and so it'll be a nice mix of students, I think, in the room, virtually and otherwise. What I'm going to do is introduce each panelist and then give them the floor, and they'll talk for a little while and again share a poem, and then we'll introduce the next panelist from there. So our first panelist is George Stanley. And George is an important and defining contributor to the poetry of the Cascadia bioregion. He was born and raised in San Francisco. George Stanley is a Canadian poet who has lived in northern BC and Vancouver. He's part of the San Francisco Renaissance, which also included Jack Spicer, Robert Duncan, Joanne Kiger, and Robin Blazer. In the 70s, he moved to British Columbia, first living in Vancouver for 5 years, then Terrace in northern British Columbia. He's the author of 5 books of poetry, including A Tall, Serious Girl, At Andes, and Gentle Northern Summer, and was the Gentle Northern Summer was the 2006 recipient of the Shelley Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America. I heard George read last night at a place called the Hummingbird Saloon, and he brought down the house, I think, with especially his last poem. And for those of you who were there, it was a great evening. And we're really lucky to have George here today in Seattle. And so please welcome George Stanley.
Thank you, Jared. If there's a copy of Make It True here, I could start by reading one poem from Make It True. And the one I'm going to read is called The Vacuum Cleaner. Page 295, if any of you have this book. The vacuum cleaner. I'd almost finished the vacuuming when the on-off switch that had been wonky for months finally broke. I couldn't turn the machine off. It was stuck on. So I finished vacuuming and unplugged it. Next week I took it into the shop. A beautiful girl came out from in back. I handed her the vacuum cleaner, the power head, that is, the attachments I'd left at home. And as she inspected it, we began to talk in a friendly way about what I don't remember, but I recall feeling that I was not just a customer to her. The beauty of girls and boys pursues me wherever I'm going. Then I had to take my head in to the clinic. I sat in the examining room waiting for the door to open. Then it did. The young doctor entered and said, "I'm Jason." Yeah, somebody was talking, we were talking last night a bit about what is this poem about? Well, it's kind of about how in certain aspects of our lives are becoming more informal. I recently got a new dentist too, and he said, "Hi George, I'm Alex." So, what I wanted to talk about, I thought today, was poetry and bioregionalism and Cascadia in particular, but I'll leave the second half of that to later. I'll just say a few words about poetry. What I'm looking for is a revival of modern poetry, so that modern poetry could be a popular art as it was in the 1960s, to the extent that it was a popular art in the 1960s, and to the extent that jazz was. And also I'd like to see a resurgence of jazz in the same sense. So modern poetry, what is it? Well, to begin with, it's poetry that is written in ordinary language, which when modern poetry began around the beginning of the 20th century, it replaced in English and in other languages kind of formalized poetic language with ordinary language. And by ordinary language, I mean the ordinary language of 2016. I don't mean the ordinary language of some previous era. That's what keeps the poetry new. It also began with a rejection of sentimentality, of the way that 19th century poets looked at nature specifically. And I think that to reject sentimentality leads immediately to a recognition of the world. And as we were driving up here, Paul, in the context of another context of poetry, mentioned the word outside, and I thought, yes, that's really what I mean. That by rejecting a sentimental view of the world, we inevitably come face to face with the world outside, which is kind of, it's ambiguous, isn't it? But I mean to imply also the world outside the mind. And I think that nowadays to reject literary theory can have a similar effect, can lead us immediately, inescapably, to a recognition of nature, to the real world that is built up out of nature. And finally, modern poetry, particularly in the 60s, is characterized by emotion, by feeling. I quote the Prince George poet Barry McKinnon, "Emotion is the fact of the poem." You can't create a poem without feeling. Feeling is the raison d'etre. You can't make up a poem on the basis of some coldly intellectual method. The last third of the 20th century in avant-garde poetry was dominated by a school called language poetry, which abandoned ordinary language because it abandoned syntax and discourse. Language poetry turned the arrow of reference around. Instead of directing the poem, instead of the poem being directed towards the world, it was directed back towards its own language. And finally, language poetry lacked emotion. So what I'd like to see is a restoration of a poetry of ordinary language, which opened up perspectives on reality, on nature, on truth, on the outside. So that's all I have to say at the moment.
Okay, that's great. Cool. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Nadine Maestas, and I love her bio. She's a poet's poet and believes that the empire of the sentence is an extremely oppressive totalitarian regime. It's true.
It is true.
She prefers the company of poems so much that she would rather read a bad poem than a good novel. But when she's not doing poetry, Nadine loves mountain biking in dangerous and remote places in the Northwest. She teaches at the University of Washington and North Seattle Community College. She's facilitated writing workshops at the University of Michigan, Youth Speaks, and has helped pioneer poetry workshops in several public schools in California and Michigan. Nadine holds an MFA from the University of Michigan, where she was awarded the Farrar Award for Playwriting. Her hybrid poem play, Helen on Wheels, a play of rhyme and reason, was performed at the California College of the Arts. She's the co-author with Karen Weiser of Beneath the Bright Discuss, and is currently writing a dissertation on postmodern American anthropoetics.
Which I actually finished, right? Like
Oh.
I am officially dissertated up and have a PhD now. That's an old bio.
She's done writing
Yeah.
a dissertation.
Dr. Maestas.
Well, welcome, Dr. Nadine Maestas.
Okay, so first I'll talk and then I'll read a poem. There's a few words for me that come up with bioregionalism, this project we've embarked on, and some keywords for me might be spirit, land, place, innovation, substance, and emotion, and of course poetry. These things are all really important to me in terms of thinking about bioregionalism. Something else that's extremely important to me is the politics and culture of the bioregion itself and what doing a project like this means. And one of the things I love about this is that within the politics of it, there's something that undermines nation-state boundaries, right? So these very man-made boundaries that make square states or bizarre borders that, like you look at the border between California and Oregon, it's just this line and it cuts right through mountain ranges that are the same. So I'm always really interested in that in particular. I've been thinking a lot about innovation in the region, and what I think is really innovative about this bioregion and poetry. And innovation, I feel like a lot of people like to think that innovation is doing something new that nobody's ever done before, but it isn't. It's actually, as George was saying earlier, to renew something, is to renew and to restore. And this is particularly important when thinking about bioregionalism and ecology. We have a lot of restoration projects going on in this state in particular, and in other states as well within the bioregion. The Elwood Dam would probably be the biggest, and in my opinion, one of the most spectacular examples of taking it down and restoring the habitat for the salmon, right, which has been an immensely successful project, far beyond what they even predicted. So to renew and to restore something back to poetry, and I believe that that is to restore emotion back in poetry, as George was saying, and substance, because what he was saying about the language poets in particular, it's like they were in many ways very anti-emotion and anti-substance, and it was born out of a very white movement that was almost rejecting emotion and substance, and they just kind of didn't know what to do with the world, and reacted in a way with language. I like to think of it when I'm talking to my own students, it's like going home and playing with your language in a room by yourself and moving it around, and not really having anything to say. And they can be amazingly excellent exercises. It's like working out with language for when you actually really want to write something. So I do value that about it, and it does seem like a necessary thing, and it wouldn't be talking about restoring substance and emotion to poetry without that movement in particular. I'm someone who comes from an academic background and have gone through reading tons and tons and tons of literary theory. And I tend to agree with George in that rejecting literary theory does open up a door to emotion, which is not to say that you should totally reject literary theory. Please don't. I might write it sometime soon. But also, there's something very peculiar and abstract and disconnected in literary theory that happens that doesn't necessarily happen in something like poetry. And poetry is something that has more immediacy to it in its language. One of the reasons I think that the sentence is so totalitarian is because it's very, very strict, and it distances us from things. You know, even language distances us. It distances us from things in the world. Probably the biggest example, or the easiest example I could come up with, is a tree, right? Once you name a tree, you start thinking of the word first, and then the actual thing in the world, right? So even just naming something creates intimate distance between us and the world. One of the things that poetry can do, and I think poetry in this bioregion in particular and in this book does, is that it can crack that distance open just a little bit. And this is something that fiction cannot do because it's so dependent on context and sentences, and it creates more and more distance. But if you can crack something open, you can have a little bit of a window into intimacy with the things in the world, right? So that's about all I have to say about that right now, and then I'll read a poem. So glad we did this alphabetically. Although I still can't find my name here. Here we go. And I'm going to read my very big poem about whales. How many of you have read Moby Dick before? Has anyone here read Moby Dick? Okay, so a couple of people. Did anyone see that movie recently about the guy and the whale in the heart of the sea? I haven't seen it either. I was just wondering. So, okay. Ahab Mayhem. With whale fat spilling all over the deck. What makes him so American mad, so cerulean cruel, so human, so like the jaws of wolves on fat, lust for the hunt on a quest like hate, also like ambition, so American emperor, nailing a gold doubloon on deck, so man of his own ship hanging the heads of 2 whales, dripping sperm, the smell of whale fat, identifiable to even the so like a virgin green beginner. Ish. You make the rope seamen use for hoisting, and meet the queerest creatures of the sea. And him, he gets so vapid vision quest, gain after gain, so supine brain dead, so interior mad, so exterior far away look in his eyes. Then to the lookout says he, "Aye, see him yet? Ah, ivory leg Ahab, digging in the deck a divot of his very own, a mark that fits his alabaster leg, fashioned from bone of whale, feeling bucolic. You Ahab, you ruin us all with your American ambition, roaring Ahab, boiling point Ahab, balls to the wall Ahab. The importance of sperm inconsequential, as if the magic white flukes of any white whale would do as well, but for this nacreous as the new moon hue, used for lighting lamps and making hairbrushes, we endlessly sail the sea sipping Nantucket water, watching for the great white spewing that by now we all want to see his hump like a snow hill, then cut the anchor and chase and chase and chase all over the surface of the ocean until we meet the eye of the whale and see him, Ahab in a whirlpool flushed like a man into the depths of damnation black vomit, like an enemy of the sea-born creatures who never thinks, but only feels home far from Nantucket and minus half a leg. He chases and chases and chases until an element emerging from the sea sucks us under and the entire Pequod yawning for help, while the ocean was gulfing, while watchful birds were winging the sea air and splintering shrieks escaped their beaks. The sea moves over lost ship shards and bones, which were once like us 5,000 years ago. And I know I want to live as the ocean floats me about in the cool deep, and while the surface of the sea was recomposing itself, the peace and quietude of thinking and remembering. Ahab, previously fishing men out of creamy pools and shark jaws, careful of his own 3 limbs, his alabaster one too, his mad tethered heart and hands and all the stars leading up to it. He came to us like that, mad without sleep, mad with resent, and with the wind and revenge, that hard, irascible puffing at his sails, that secret interior madness and how it became a furious exterior. Oh, lonely life on lonely death, my American mood for hate's sake, clinging to the wood like a man who wants to live to tell. I am clinging to the coffin of my mate, all dead, I think. I am to become a fire in the heads of, hello, my name is Ishmael.
Thank you, Nadine. Our last panelist is Paul Nelson, and I've known Paul for almost 15 years, and I've gotten to know our other 2 panelists through him. I've gotten to know really all of these other poets that appear in the anthology Make It True that Paul edited along with Nadine and George and Barry McKinnon. So 3 of the editors of your book are here in front of you, and I encourage anybody out online to take a look at Make It True. We have a link to it on our additional resources. And with getting to know Paul, he does so many things. He's a poet, an interviewer, an essayist. He founded Seattle Poetics Lab, the Cascadia Poetry Festival. He wrote the books American Sentence, that just came out not too long ago, A Time Before Slaughter, which was shortlisted for the 2010 Genius Award by The Stranger. He's written a book of essays called Organic Poetry and Organic in Cascadia, The Sequence of Energies. He's interviewed almost everyone. Allen Ginsberg, Michael McClure, Sam Hamill, Jose Koza, Robin Blazer, Nate Mackey, Joanne Kiger, George Bowering, Brenda Hillman, and Daphne Marlatt. He's presented poetry or on poetics in London, Brussels, Nanaimo, in China. His work has been translated into Spanish, Chinese, and Portuguese, and he writes an American sentence every day. He was awarded a residency at the Lake from the Morris Graves Foundation in Lolita, California. He's published work in Golden Handcuffs Review, Zen Monster, Hambone, and elsewhere. He's the winner of the 2014 Robin Blazer Award from the Capilano Review, and he lives in the Duwamish River watershed. Please welcome Paul Nelson.
Thanks. First of all, what an opportunity this is to be a 17-year-old in a class like this. What I would have done to have a similar experience. You're very fortunate, and I know it takes a lot of work to be in this position, and that's just wonderful. Second of all, I'm very honored to be in the company of these folks who are really dedicated to the life of a poet. I think they really understand what Michael McClure would call a pure poet, and I like to think of myself in that way. So I'm very grateful that we've been able to put this book together and begin to work on this bioregional cultural investigation. I think you're also very fortunate with a teacher like Jared, because he's really hardworking. He's quick to communicate, very clearly communicates. He's really dedicated, and he's really making this course, this MOOC, a very special thing. And it's very gratifying to see one of your ideas taken by someone like Jared, and to see him run with it and to do it in such a first-class way. I also want to point out something that they do in Canada, which I think I'd like to see us do more here, and that is that recognize that we're on the ancestral ground of the Duwamish people, of many different coastal Salish tribes, including speakers whose native language is Lushootseed, which is the language of the local people from about this King-Snohomish County line on north in Puget Sound, and south of the line, and we're just in Snohomish County, just over the county line. Is that right?
We're technically still in King County
Technically
at times.
still King County.
But
So,
we're close.
so the change between Lushootseed, that's just north of here, to the dialect called Walshootseed, which the Muckleshoot tribe, that's their historic language. So I just want to say that we are on their ancestral homeland, and we recognize that, and we pay homage to that, and we realize the cultural situation that we're in because of that. So there's a couple of texts that if anyone asks me, so what are your first two salvos in terms of Cascadia and in terms of poetry? One is associated with this course. It's linked. You can read the PDF. Why Cascadia? Why poetry? And I think there's a couple of really good points that I'd like to bring up from that. And the other is organic and Cascadia, a sequence of energies. And I presented this at a convergence right across, actually right down this way, here at UW-Bothell, so your sister institution. And the first thing to talk about is Cascadia itself, and the notion that we live in a bioregion, and there's a beautiful map. I don't know if you've seen it in the other building, but take a look at it if you haven't seen it. It's itself a work of art, and itself was created to be evocative and to give you a different sense. And a lot of people have criticized the Cascadia movement because they say this is about an armed resurrection and, you know, being like Paul Revere and the Minutemen and violently separating from Canada and the United States. You know, we'd be happy just to see Bernie Sanders get elected president, you know, one step at a time. So what we're interested in is a cultural investigation. So to look at the culture of this place. So when you look at the map, you see that the bioregion actually starts in Cape Mendocino, California. And if you follow the San Andreas Fault, it goes out and goes about 1,000 miles due west. And when you think about these plates going under plates and creating these periodic earthquakes, of which we've had a few recently in Alaska and in Canada, you begin to understand the forces at work here. And if we look at how Mother Nature would create a nation, what kind of boundaries would have been created if we went along the lines of someone like John Wesley Powell, who, if you Google John Wesley Powell West Watersheds map, you'll see what his idea of the map should have been. It looks something like this. So instead of those square states like Wyoming and Colorado, he would have something that's along the line of watersheds. And David McCloskey and others have been working for over 30 years to kind of figure out how would this be geologically to determine what the quote-unquote national boundaries might be. So the first thing is the actual map and our connection to place. So when we think of ourselves first as connected to a place rather than a country, not to say we shouldn't be good Americans or good Canadians, but we should think of ourselves first as people of a place, and a place that has consistent culture that is emerging, and you know, things like salmon and cedar and hemlock and the things that we love about this part of the world, this natural part of the world. And if you look at our time in history, capitalism is falling apart. When you guys get to be our age, who knows what it's going to look like? Emanuel Wallerstein says it's going to happen in the next 50 years, and what's going to replace it, we don't know. It might be worse than what we have right now. If you can imagine that, an economic system which depends on doing things like eviscerating Alberta to extract the tar sands, which if you've ever seen a picture of the tar sands area, it's what you would imagine hell would look like. And I think that might be really a good definition for what's happening there. So capitalism will take out everything, including the biosphere, and I believe that's not going to happen this time. So what's going to replace it? Who knows? But if we look at our sense of place as this bioregion than a country, we realize that other things are possible besides that. I think when you look at straight lines on a map, which Nadine said were man-made, and she meant man-made, she didn't mean human-made, they were made by men, this notion that you can cut off watersheds. So it's like they could say it's not our problem, it's their problem, you know, and defer the blame for events like the Flint water crisis, in which people are being sickened by the lead content, ostensibly as a cost-cutting move, but it turns out, no, it's actually was a way that they lost money and are sickening people in the state of Michigan from what's going on. So that's a little bit about bioregionalism and tuning into place. And in terms of the poetry, Mallarmé, I think, said it best, that poetry is the language for a state of crisis. So if you look at our economic and crisis that we're having, and our crisis of, you know, you call it climate change, I think anthropogenic climate disorder, ACD, is probably a more apt term. And you look at that, and poetry is, I think, the best way because, as Nadine was pointing out, of its immediacy and its ability to communicate beyond the language. When I hear George read that poem again, as I heard last night, when I hear Nadine read her poem, more becomes revealed to me as I hear it a second and a third and a fourth time. And how Ahab is a great image for, you know, any capitalists. You know, if Ahab were alive today, we wouldn't have pity for him. He'd be up for the Republican nomination
he
for
absolutely
president,
would be.
you know.
Yeah.
So, and they would value him for going after that whale. I was rooting for you to have the whale.
Yeah.
So poetry is obviously my fallback. And when we start talking about innovative poetry, George pointed out the limitations of language poetry, and fortunately that moment has passed. I think there were a lot of good things that came from that, but I think we're beyond it. What seems to have replaced it in the poetry world in North America is conceptual poetry, and that is, I think, best exemplified by Vanessa Place, who is tweeting Gone with the Wind, 140 characters at a time, with its outdated, vulgar, offensive, racist language, just to try and get them to sue her so she can have some kind of way of saying that, you know, you don't own it, so put in question the ownership. And then Kenny Goldsmith, who reads Michael Brown's autopsy report. Michael Brown, of course, was the young man who was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri. So reading this autopsy report as a poem, as a conceptual poem, and of course getting a great deal of grief as he should have gotten. I think that if you practice the practice of outside, as is very popular in this bioregion, you end up contacting impulses that are beyond yourself, whether it be the collective unconscious or the muse or however you want to put it, and those things are less likely to happen. And I think that's part of the beauty of this bioregion. We're influenced very much by Asian culture. In fact, Kenneth Rexroth said, we look more to Asia, people on the West Coast, than we do to European culture. Now, that doesn't mean we don't take with us all the European baggage that we came here with or that our culture has, but we have the East and the wisdom cultures of the East as examples to inform us. Michael McClure was especially inspired by Huayan Buddhism, and if you ever look into the jewel net of Indra, you'll get a sense of the main metaphor for that wisdom tradition. And of course, I do yoga, so that goes into the Hindu wisdom tradition, and I'm a Subud practitioner, which was founded in Indonesia. So the East informs us more so than Europe on this coast, and especially this bioregion. And also indigenous people. As I preface this talk with being on the ancestral homeland of the Duwamish people and other tribes here, this is a town, Seattle is, that was named after a great chief. And in his speech, which I quote in this essay, and of course you have to keep in mind that his speech was translated into the flowery poetic language of the time, sort of a Victorian, sentimental kind of thing. But if you can cut through that and listen to what Chief Seattle said in his famous speech, he said, even the rocks, which seem to be dumb and dead as the swelter in the sun along the silent shore, thrill with memories of stirring events connected with the lives of my people, and the very dust upon which you now stand responds more lovingly to their footsteps than yours, because it is rich with the blood of our ancestors, and our bare feet are conscious of the sympathetic touch. Our departed braves, fond mothers, glad, happy-hearted maidens, and even the little children who lived here and rejoiced here for a brief season will love these somber solitudes, and at eventide they greet shadowy returning spirits. And when the last red man shall have perished, and the memory of my tribe shall have become a myth among the white men, these shores will swarm with the invisible dead of my tribe. And when your children's children think themselves alone in the field, the store, the shop, upon the highway, or in the silence of the pathless woods, they will not be alone. That's what Chief Seattle said. And I think that empirical science is beginning to catch up to the notion that place has memory. And I would point to Rupert Sheldrake, whose work is very controversial, but I think very much ahead of his time, about morphic resonance and how places have memory. And you can tap into that if you can listen closely enough. So we are influenced by indigenous and Asian wisdom traditions, and the beautiful place. I mean, how many bioregions in the world can you water ski or kayak, you know, in the morning, surf in the morning, and then in the afternoon go skiing in the mountains? Very few places. So the fjords, the islands, the volcanoes, all the amazing natural features that we take for granted here are remarkably world-class, and so we're very blessed. And to be able to tap into that, the power of these places, the energetics of these places, is part of the charge that we have here to use poetry. And so the last thing I want to talk about is the innovative poetry. I think that the most open form certainly in North America, and I don't want to go into world poetry, but I think it is world-class, along with the coastal Salish art of people like Susan Point and Robert Davidson and Bill Reed and others like that, is the serial poem. George Stanley is a practitioner of the serial poem, as open as it can be, something that Robin Blazer called a narrative of the spirit. Robin Blazer, who left San Francisco and was at the beginning of founding of Simon Fraser University, which has an amazing library and special collections library that Tony Power runs, which specializes in beat and Black Mountain literature. So this notion of going outside of yourself, of writing a lifelong serial poem that is a narrative of the spirit, the ending of which you don't know, and in fact may be open-ended. Maybe someone could take Robin Blazer where he left off and continue what he was talking about in the Holy Forest. The point is that it is as open as possible, and I think that's where the real innovation comes. I don't think that we tapped into that Black Mountain organic projective school. I think we only scratched the surface of it. And I think that's, if you can combine sort of a Gary Snyder sense of being in the wild and knowing the names of the plants and the animals and the rocks, with a wilderness of mind of people like Robert Duncan and Robin Blazer and others, you're beginning to, and with a deep emotional content, or as Barry McKinnon said, the fact of the emotion is the fact of the poem. So we have to have an emotion, not a maudlin emotion, not a sentimentality, but something much deeper than that. If you want to look at the cheapness of sentimentality, look at what James Baldwin says about sentimentality. The ostentatious parading of excessive and spurious emotion, the mark of dishonesty, the inability to feel. He said, the wet eyes of the sentimentalist betray his aversion to experience, his fear of life, his arid heart, and it's always, therefore, the signal of secret and violent inhumanity, the mask of cruelty. And I was reminded of that quote when Chris Hedges was writing a review about American Sniper, and that the best people who create movies like that can do is sentimentality, because they are averse to deep human feeling. Because if they had that, they wouldn't be making movies about snipers in the first place. So I will end my part with a poem. I'm not going to read from, maybe I am going to read from the anthology. This is the one that was chosen for the Robin Blazer Award, and it's in the book, and it also is another nod to the indigenous people of this bioregion. And it's a haibun. It's a haibun, which is a Japanese form, which is part prose poetry, part haibun-like or haiku-like poem. And this is called "The Day the Weather Decided to Die," and it's on page 216 if you're following along in your hymnals. After a Haida tale told by Robert Bringhurst, who's done amazing work to translate that wisdom culture into English. And the epigraph is by Ramon Gomez de la Serna, who said, "On hearing the wooden rumble of thunder, we realize that we are situated below the platform of the sky. What constitutes a good family, they say, and give instructions to servants under the backdrop of the hugest sucking sound in history, prelude to when the wind did no longer rumble from under the skirt of the great Ma, no longer float a blue heron's hacho side lumber, no longer sustain. Age of celebrity tattoo news, of the rise of Yurok, Duwamish, Tsimshian, Haida, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, Musqueam, of tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, Beast Islands, Fukushima, and Fukushimas to come. The weather born out of cockleshell embryo or out of snot, weather that hunts birds and sends winds out in the skins of blue jay, weather that steals hats of campesinos, compassions, for kicks, weather that would sprout houses when adopted by a master carver, weather that would be a scholar of carving. The weather when painted would sit facing the sea, would weep for owls with spots in the new northward range of Dolphin's neighborhood, weather that would warn of the big ones who think of biting, weather whose big fish story is dried halibut, and waits and waits and waits for a shift in settler rituals. It could start with "Today is a good day to die." It could start with "The inheritance of the campesino, compression, who opened up about his daily prayers for humility, or when he, the one born in a cockle shell, would dress as wren and sit way above the sea as a cumulus cloud, waiting to see what his latihan would bring, dance, song, chant, or something more cathartic just beyond his outstretched wings. Remember, crows, your brothers, stumps never lie. We hold up the sky. Back to the wide shot.
So what we'd like to do now is open it up to questions from the audience and to those of you online. And just raise your hand and we'll kind of try to speak up if you can. And panelists, I might try to restate it in case the camera doesn't pick it up. So, questions?
Right behind you here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Dean.
So Paul, I just wanted to touch on this. Like you mentioned, American Sniper, which was really gratifying. That's something I've been saying for a very long time, and I got a lot of grief for that. But I wanted to kind of talk about sentimentality. That's something that's very prevalent in mainstream media, and that a lot of people like and prefer. And how would you kind of, what changes do you think you'd like to see in more mainstream media to kind of cut that out and cut more to a truth?
Well, I was a media guy for 26 years. I was in the radio business for a long time. And I think the changes in media are only going to reflect where people are at. So if they think they can get you to buy jeans or deodorant or soap or hair product by putting sentimentality out, that's what they're going to put out. So people have to start to reject it. I remember when my oldest daughter, who's now 24 and a journalist in DC, when I married Meredith or got together with her, she said, you have a TV in the house? My daughter was shocked that we had a TV. And my wife at the time said, yeah, your dad likes to watch ESPN, you know. And she said, you've changed him. Because she grew up in my house without a television. You know, my ex-wife picked up Nadine's daughter from school the other day because Nadine was coming back from our gigs in Vancouver. And my ex-wife Meredith said, so Alma, you want to maybe go have a hot chocolate at Starbucks? And she said, Starbucks? My parents don't really like going to chain stores. You know, so when the consciousness of not going to chain stores and not falling for sentimental tripe, it becomes widespread, the media will reflect that shift in culture. And I think that as people have a deeper experience with life, they realize that these Hollywood movies are pretty cheap, pretty empty, and they'll go for something a little deeper. I finally saw a Hollywood movie a couple of days ago, Brooklyn, and it was old-fashioned narrative about an Irish immigrant's experience in the United States. It was a beautiful movie. I can't deal with violence. I can't watch it. I had to leave one movie, X-Files, years ago. I just couldn't take it. I had to leave. It was too much. I still think about the violent images in that movie. Yeah. And I think when the society is more like that and less, I mean, I think the society is very desensitized towards violence. You talk about that shooter in Kentucky, in the Kentucky high school 15 years ago, and what was he doing in the high school? And he was shooting people at the cafeteria. One shot here, and he was aiming for this part up because the video game training that he got gave him points for headshots. So that's what he carried out. He was only doing his practice in the video game and carried it out. And with all the violent images that we get, even if you want to watch a football game, I've got a 3.5, almost 4-year-old girl, can't even watch a football game because the commercials are on and it's all this shooting and violence, and you know, you almost have to shield her eyes. Kids in this culture are so exposed to violence that they're desensitized to it, and that's really a sickness. I think in any real culture that would be seen as something that needs to be dealt with by healthcare professionals. Yeah. But here it sells soap. So when we make the shift in ourselves, the media I think will follow, but they'll be behind us.
In fact, that's something that Allen Ginsberg said frequently about American culture, is it wasn't the people that, like his colleagues being like the beat poets that mainstream America was calling crazy and mad. He said, we're not the mad ones, you are. And look what you're doing to people, look what you're doing to yourselves, look what you're doing to the economy, look what you're doing to the planet. And we're not the sick ones, you are. We can see what's happening.
And we have humane feelings, and that's why we castigate it. We are the real outlaws, the people who have humane feelings for others, for human life, for other mammals.
Other questions, comments? Go ahead.
Is there a movie that you've seen recently that demonstrates more of a human connection rather than just point and shoot kind of thing?
I think Laurie Anderson's new movie, Heart of the Dog, is brilliant. Laurie Anderson, who was married to Lou Reed, and so was suffering from her grief of Lou Reed, and then lost her dog, a little rat terrier, wrote this movie ostensibly about her dog, but turned out to be about grief, and really turned out to be about death and life and living. When we think about death, I think it's a good thing. When we think about our own death, I mean, George's poems about his death that he read last night were beautiful and poignant. And you know, someone reading that in 100 years is going to be able to say that and think maybe it's not so bad. Maybe I can not be so freaked out like Americans are. Laurie Anderson, back in I think it was like 1980, had this piece called "Oh Superman," in which it had this. She played this violin that had sound, so it would play a voice as she played this violin, and did really wild things. There was a great video of it, and it had this sort of voice rhythm track that went ha 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 ha. And if you see that online, it stands up, and it's like 35, 36 years old. It's beautiful. So take that kind of talent 36 years ago, add with it all the energy of this grief, and you look at this movie, and it's incredibly beautiful. It's the kind of movie where after you watch it, you sit in the theater and you watch all the credits and you kind of take it in, and you don't eat the popcorn, the rest of the popcorn you didn't eat. You're so moved by it. So that would be one I'd recommend, very much so. And there's going to be one screening in here on the 4th. It's not a Hollywood movie, it's a documentary, but you know, it's about poetry, so I was partial to it. The Line Has Shattered. That'll be an interesting chat.
I'm trying to make some sense about this idea, which both of you came up with, that the depiction of violence is sentimental. Because, I mean, to me, sentimentality, the kind I was talking about in 19th century poetry, was how beautiful is the forest, say, and then the focus is not upon the forest, it's not upon the forest, it's upon my feeling of its being beautiful, my experience of my own reaction to it. I guess that's what I think of as being sentimentality, and it cuts you off from the outside. But how is the depiction of violence sentimental? It seems it's almost the reverse, that gratuitous violence, in a sense that is forced upon us if we experience the media like movies, it cancels out the possibility of feeling somehow for the victim of the violent act.
I think this, when the sentimentality comes in American Sniper, and I didn't see the movie, so I know, is honoring this man whose life's work was, you know, picking off people with a scoped rifle, and citing this man as a hero, and whatever challenges he had to go through afterwards. I don't know. I've not seen the movie. I wouldn't see it. So I think that the sentimentality is about this man and his work more so than the actual violent acts.
It's interesting the subject comes up, though. I mean, what subject is more on everyone's mind nowadays but this gratuitous, spontaneous violence, particularly with guns? Just happened 3 days ago in Saskatchewan, in a First Nations village in northern Saskatchewan. A boy, 17-year-old boy, just shot two of his young cousins and went out to the school and shot 2 other people. And then come the attempts to explain in a larger context why such a thing would happen. And we come down to the fact that in the particular town, there was no youth center. There wasn't even a coffee shop, although there were 2 bars. The cause of this gratuitous violence comes down to the absence of something else. The absence of ultimately, it's the absence of a budget when it comes down to political reality. I was thinking that what does poetry have to do with bioregionalism? it's a kind of a leap. I can't really say what poetry has to do with bioregionalism, except that I go back to, again, the line from Barry McKinnon, which Paul just quoted. Again, emotion is the fact of the poem. The kind of emotion you may feel may be an experience of beauty, it may be an emotion of hope, but it may also be an emotion of anger or of outrage. The inescapable fact of climate change, the effects that climate change, the early phases we're in of climate change are all felt in a specific bioregion. The storms, recent storms on the Oregon coast, the floods in Calgary. I don't believe in the United States we can any longer, or the United States government, whether it be Democratic or Republican, is letting us down on its responsibility as stated in the preamble of the Constitution to promote the general welfare. And if that is not being done by governments, I would have said the same thing about the Canadian government too, except we had an election 3 months ago, and we now have a very optimistic, possibly a more liberal and compassionate government. We'll see. But if we cannot rely upon governments to promote the general welfare, it comes down to the people themselves. The best example to go back to is Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where the federal government fell down terribly, and what help was given to people was given by their friends and neighbors there in that particular region. That, I think, is one of the justifications for bioregional, for seeing things more in terms of our relations to our friends and neighbors and the land of this region.
We have a question online from Elena Amber B, and she asked, how would you describe sentimentality in a poem? And I'm wondering what you think about this, Nadine, just because I think George has sort of talked about it in a historical sense. But now when you think about it in both poems you read as a teacher of writing and in other ways, how do you see that?
Oh man, ironically, even just thinking about that, one of the first poets that comes to mind is Mary Oliver, right? There's a sense of sentimentality about nature in her poems that she's always writing about. And it's almost like a distant longing or something like that. That doesn't really feel like she's in nature, but just sort of talking about it from a distance. Like there's almost no experience there. And maybe it might lack a kind of experience to it, more of kind of like an idealism of emotion or something like that.
When I interviewed Allen Ginsberg in 1994, and I have some of the transcription on my website, paulenelson.com, he talked about writing spontaneously in a time when he was writing a chain poem with Trogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and he said the monk bent down to lace his animal shoes. He's like, animal shoes, what is that? Oh, leather. And so he changed it to leather. But Trungpa was like, no, that's interesting. Animal shoes. You don't hear that all the time. My leather shoes, okay. Animal shoes, that's poetry, right? So before you filter it, here's what Allen said. Before you filter that thing, and you usually filter it because you want people to like you, right? So you can't say what he said. And here's what he said. Before you filter it, it usually comes in as a kind of raw, emotionally interesting gleam, usually visual. And he quotes Kerouac, don't stop to think of words, but to see picture better. So in other words, before you think of the words that describe that picture, just give us the picture. Show, don't tell, is what we tell all the beginner poets. So Ginsberg says, what people tend to do is be a little ashamed of their minds or their raw thoughts. That's too personal, or that's just me. Maybe I should generalize on it. And he says, say I'm having a dream in which I'm sleeping with my mother. No, I don't want to write about that. People would judge me for that. So I think I'll say, I had a dream in which I did something bad. Or I had a dream in which I outraged society, or something like that. And he says, you lose the humor, you lose the contradictoriness and the quiddity, the essence, and humanity of that. And he quotes William Blake, and he paraphrases Blake, but I like Ginsberg's quote better, his paraphrase: generalization and abstraction are the plea of the hypocrite, knave, and scoundrel. So when you have to do that, abstract or generalize, you're hiding something. And what the poet does is be less than generous with us. Because we want a glimpse of their deepest soul, of their deepest fears, of going into the darkness, as George has mentioned in a poem of his I was recently reading. We want them to go as far deep down their throat as possible. When they don't do that, we feel cheated. We want that deep glimpse as far down your throat, in the words of Lissa Walsek, that you can be. So that's why modernists like Kerouac, like William Carlos Williams, no ideas but in things, or as Ginsberg would say, give me a for instance, in the American language of the time.
Glad you brought up Blake, because the other poet I was thinking of was William Wordsworth. He would be like the foil and an exemplary example of sentimentality. You know, his poem, I wandered lonely as a cloud over hill and dale. It's just, you know, you don't really feel like he's wandering at all like a cloud over the hill and dale. It's like he's just, I don't know what he's doing, but he's not doing that. And it's really just the way that he's writing it, because he probably actually was doing that, wandering over hills and whatnot. But it's that distance and artifice that he's created that impedes the sort of genuine feeling of being there, whereas somebody like William Blake, he just like throws you in it. You know, you're like in it. He's like, here's heaven and hell, you're in it. You know, if there's babies dying, you're in it. And it's just very extremely different. I find that when my students are writing, they do rely on sentimentality most when they're afraid to say something. And you know there's something there, you can tell, because it's the most generic part of the poem. You know, it's like a bright red light, and you're just like, this is not right. I recently had a student write a poem about a chocolate chip cookie that was like, she took it off like a Toll House bag of cookies and just added line breaks. One way I'm like, oh, this is sort of entertaining, but there was something she was trying to get at that she couldn't break through about this chocolate chip cookie. And she wanted to really talk about like the substance and the act of making it and what it smells like, but she left all of that out and instead just had this sort of generic thing. And the best thing in this poem was she compared one of the chocolate chips in the cookie to a UFO. Right? That was like the redeeming quality. So at that point, you know, I just have to pinpoint this and start her there and say, let's begin from this comparison that you're doing between the chocolate chip cookie and a UFO. And why did you do that? And where do you want to go with that? What do you really want to say about this chocolate chip cookie? You know, and it's just kind of weird. It's like the same thing. It's like what she's doing is the same thing I was talking about with the tree earlier. You know, she's thinking about the cookie, but not thinking beyond the cookie itself. I know it's a little bit of a strange example to be spending so much time talking about a chocolate chip cookie, and someone will probably go get cookies after this, right?
There's some in the back.
But you know, she's just she's seeking some other kind of connection to the substance of what composes this chocolate chip cookie that she either finds so delicious or, you know, whatever.
And it's probably the best use in a poem of the word Carrageenan. Because those substances they put in cookies and stuff.
I think that's what's come up just in the last few comments is the best thing to be said about sentimentality. It is using generalization, talking in a general way in order to avoid saying something that might leave you out on a limb, to use a metaphor. I'm thinking that in Canada particularly now, the way that non-Aboriginal people speak about Aboriginal culture, and these are people who feel themselves to be quite sympathetic with the struggles of First Nations, and they talk about as soon as they say their culture, as if there were not over 100 different First Nations, and their deep feeling of unity with nature, as if in specific First Nations did not see a great deal of conflict in nature. It's avoiding avoiding the facts.
I also want to say one other thing about this subject before we get to the next question, and that George was there in the late 50s and early 60s with Duncan and Spicer and Blazer, and modifying these theories or coming up with new theories about poetry and finding affinities with people like Charles Olson and Denise Levertov. And Duncan said the poem, when he writes, the poem is an event. It's not the record of an event. So like Nadine says, the poem is supposed to close the distance. When you're writing with abstractions and generalities, you're creating distance.
Yeah.
And when you're in the moment, as immersed as these poets have been, you are closing that distance. And that's part of the reason why Olson said that the poem should be a high energy construct. There's more energy in it. So do you feel like you're being led on some trip by someone, or looking at somebody's slideshow, or looking at postcards of a sunset? Or do you really feel like you're there watching the sun in that great way that it reflects off the buildings of downtown Seattle around here?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, that sort of abstraction and generalization creating distance, because the other side of it is that we want connection, right? We want connection and we want intimacy, we want intimate connection with each other, with the world, and in a way we've never been more connected in our entire history and simultaneously disconnected from each other. And particularly in America, we're just like mortified of intimacy and being connected. We're terrified of it. You know, we don't want to share things. We like have this, you know, sense of wanting to be private or present ourselves in such a way that we are likable, right? And you can see this. I mean, Facebook is the most exemplary example. It has like buttons, you know, and people are producing these lives that always look fun and amazing, and they're like doing these great things, you know, and then when somebody posts something that's like actually real, and they're like, I'm in pain and I'm crying, people are like, why would you put this on Facebook? Why don't you just smile? And it's like, man, this person is like reaching out in the most connected forum for actual connection and being rejected, right? Like it's hard for people to see emotional vulnerability and walk up to it and touch it and be there with it or for it. It's hard for us often to do it with ourselves. But you know, it's just something very strange in America going on right now that is going to break. Yeah.
This is, we have another question from someone online. Lori Langston is writing kind of around the same topic, and she says, at times, I feel like my work is too dark, too personal. When I edit my internal stream, the poems seem mechanical. Is it better to homogenize the work to make it more palatable?
No, don't do that. Do not homogenize anything anymore. No, I don't think it's better to homogenize things. And I think maybe there's a sense of, you know, what do you really want out of your writing? You know, do you want everyone to like it, or do you want to inspire somebody? You want to inspire something, or you know, have a sense of connection. You know, do you want to hide, or do you want to throw it out there? I think that exploring those dark places will help you develop new forms and new strengths with which to go to the world. And you know, there's always going to be people that will connect with that when you are being your true self. And I totally get that about, like, there's been so many times where I've over-edited a poem and I'm like, oh my God, what did I do to this thing? It just, like, I don't even recognize it anymore. And I've taken everything important out of it. And now it feels like an exercise, you know, and there's value in that. There's absolutely value in that, because you're practicing writing, you're practicing poetic technique, and things like that. But also, when I take it so far to that extreme, I know that I have to go back, if possible, to the original and look at those places that I was like mortified of, you know, that I was like embarrassed to show anybody. Why was I embarrassed to show anybody that? In that poem that I read, Ahab Mayhem, I did edit something out that I struggled with for a long time, and I had a lot of feedback on it. The line that's like, that, what is it, God lack damnation vomit? I think it used to be, yeah, it used to say fucking in it. And I edited that out, and I struggled with that for a very, very long time. Like, do I leave the fucking in? Do I take the fucking out? You know, what do I do with this fucking? Like, who's gonna be offended?
What do I
who's
do
not
with this
gonna be
fucking?
offended? I know, seriously fucking shit, yeah. So
In this
yeah.
question, this student who just sent a text, a tweet.
Yeah, we're
She puts,
chatting. Yeah.
She puts mechanical in contrast with homogenizing. That is, I read her as saying, I don't like this mechanical quality of my poem, so I want to homogenize it. But the interesting word there is mechanical. Mechanical is something specific. I mean, I immediately thought of the Frankenstein monster when there is a piece of literature where the depiction of the being has to be mechanical. Maybe there's something in her poem that has to be mechanical, even though at a sentimental level she may be thinking, oh, I shouldn't be mechanical because it doesn't flow like a poem should. So,
But maybe it's a hybrid.
Go for, if there's something really strange in your poems, stick with it. Right? And also another thing, totally unrelated, Jack Spicer said once, if you got a really good line in the first draft of your poem, cross that line out.
I have a couple of thoughts about that, and
Can we see if there's a question on here first?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, what's the end game, Lori, in terms of what do you want to do with your poetry, like you were talking about, I would say if you feel like you have to homogenize it, if you're thinking of an audience, you kind of miss something. George Bowring has a great line in the Vancouver Sun from 5 years ago. He said, when a poem has you in its grip, you have to shut up all your usual yapping and listen as hard as you can. If it continues to work and nothing interrupts it, you will get to be the first reader of the poem. It will be a happy event.
That's right.
Which is a very interesting way of looking at it, because that, in 2 sentences, really shows the practice of outside. Not only are you the writer of the poem, but you're the first reader of it.
Mm-hmm.
So suggesting that you're tapping forces outside yourself and that you're on the right path.
Yeah.
Permission to be weird, granted.
Permission to be weird, yeah. I was thinking with the word mechanical, I immediately thought of the Victorian poets. You know, they were so artifice happy, poetic device happy, that sometimes they just, you're like, what is really in this poem? Too much working out. Yeah.
Other questions? We'll go for a little longer, and then we'll take a break, and we can mingle and talk after that.
Behind you, Jared.
Oh, sorry.
I'm back.
You just speak up.
Nadine, I was wondering how you feel about, because you mentioned that you don't really like traditional sentence structures and novels and that sort of thing. How do you feel about more modern authors like I would say like Sula Sadistrom or even Miller Radopovic, who are kind of doing really like weird things and involving more forms and poetry and making a novel into more of like a flowing, interesting, creative work?
Okay, so one of the things about the novel in sentences, one of the things about the sentence for me is that it is so strict that it almost, sentences can be beautiful. It's my personal opinion that Hemingway really ruined the sentence in America, and the art of it. The art of the sentence was really lost. But when things like that, like this type of writing that you're starting to talk about, there's only so far it can go within that form before it falls outside of that form, right? So once it goes too far, people start tagging it with like, that's very poetic, or like these are poetic forms, and it's no longer really a novel in a sense. It's already dipping into my land, and once it doesn't fit that, people tag it with poetry for a reason. Like poetry is like where everything else falls. Like once you exceed the boundaries of a form, it's poetry. I don't know why people started doing this, but they do, right? And so the novel is probably one of the strictest literary forms that you can write in. And it's also driven by one of the other strictest forms, the sentence, right? So, I'm always interested in things, in types of writing like that, but more so I'm always interested in how and when people start tagging it as poetry.
I kind of like to turn that question on George and ask him about a specific example, because when I think about a novel like that, which is something that breaks the rules, doesn't have characters per se or plot or any of the other things that you expect in a novel, one of the things that comes up is trout fishing in America.
Oh yeah, it's a great book.
And George was there when Richard Brodigan was having that book edited by Jack Spicer. So
Yeah.
maybe you can talk a little bit about that specifically.
Well, I don't know the process. It's certainly, I think it's Brodigan's best book, Trout Fishing in America. The novel, is a form that comes up, it begins in the mid-18th century. And by the 19th century, people are beginning to live by novels. They've stopped living by religion, that is, getting their ideas about how to live from religion, and they're now getting them from novels. And that persists up to pretty much close to the present time. I don't know, the people keep writing and publishing more and more novels. Even gone back to the contemporary version of the novel that tells you all about the entire society, like Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections. And then there are other novels that are more. I don't know.
Novels are bizarrely intertwined with capitalism as well, right? They're definitely like marked with capitalism.
You have to, in order to read a novel, you have to allow yourself to enter into a story that is not your own. And that, you can have a variety of reactions to that possibility. Like, one reaction is, I want to plunge into a story that is not my own because I don't want to think of my own story. On the other hand, you may, as I do right now, resist fiction because it takes me away from the world, the outside. It takes me into someone else's story. So I'm resisting novels. I'm resisting movies that are novel-like, etc. I don't know, but I'm going to wildly generalize here and say that what does this concept of postmodern mean? It means nothing more than what the word says. It means the end of modernity. Well, what was modernity? The modern era. I think that we have come or are coming to the end of the modern era, which began in the mid-18th century. And to me, the three things that were invented in the mid-18th century were reading, conversation, and play. And I see all of those things threatened at present. I was talking to some ESL, and I'm just digressing wildly, but I was talking to some ESL instructors, and they told me something that had never occurred to me. They said, our students don't read in their own language. So they were talking specifically of Korean and Mexican students. And I had somehow assumed that these students who are learning English in Canada were good readers in Korean or Spanish. But no, they're not, according to my ASL instructors. They only read snippets online. So there is a crisis of reading going on. At the same time, and Nadine was referring to this too, in the crisis of intimacy, to a certain extent, texting has replaced conversation, because even conversation on the telephone, because it's conversation on the telephone, or even more so face-to-face, is just too open-ended. There are too many possible things that could happen. Yeah. Whereas if you're texting, you can make sure exactly what you're saying, and with no possibility of being misunderstood, or very little anyway.
Yeah.
And that's not intimate.
It actually, reminds me of something else that's, for me, particularly difficult, is the isolation of reading novels. It's very isolated. In order to have a community, you've got to go to a book club, or everyone's got to be reading the same book, and then you might talk about it in some substantive way. But it's almost like there's very little external community when it comes to novels and fiction in particular. I don't know that I would necessarily say the same thing about nonfiction. I would have to think about that more. But there's something, and it's very much a 20th century thing, going into a room or to a corner and reading by yourself. There's very little connection in that. Whereas with poetry, you go to a reading, there's a lot of people there. Someone's reading their poem there. You're experiencing it and you're reading it with your ears. And then you can also go into a corner alone by yourself and read a book of poetry. But it tends to have a lot more community surrounding it.
Well, also
right?
you may want to read it aloud. If you read,
Yeah.
if you're reading a
It's oral.
poem and you like the poem, you may want to read it aloud to hear how it sounds.
Yeah. Yeah, I always say, one thing I always say is that, you have to read poetry with your ears. Even when
Yes.
you're reading it, like,
Yes,
by
right,
yourself. You gotta
right.
read it with your ears.
Right.
With a show of hands, how many of you have read any of these aloud, just in reading the book? It's okay, Michelle. Did you read some?
Couple here.
Yeah?
2 people.
Yeah.
Which ones did you read aloud? Do you remember?
Well, it was for the assignment that you gave us.
Earlier.
It was for like Ian Dodge. It was about the vomiting one because I thought it was funny.
Did you read it to someone else or
No.
to?
Yeah.
Just to yourself. That's good. Other questions? I know you guys have some. You always have some good ideas, good thoughts. Yeah.
Talking about reading out loud, because when I was reading Paul's, it was hard. I started to read out loud because it was hard to read it.
Mhm.
And then listening to him read it, it made more sense. But reading it by myself, I was struggling with it.
Yeah.
Just because of the cadence. Reading, because you read it like you wrote it, and you know what you were thinking, and so the cadence was there. When I was reading it, it was off.
This is the ordinary conversational sound of the English language. One poet we haven't mentioned, Josephine Miles, a poet of the 60s, introduced, very influential on me, the conversational tone into the poem. But that's exactly what movements like language poetry and conceptualism are. They have eliminated that, the actual discourse and syntax of language, so that when you hear something, you can understand it. They eliminated it for methodical reasons, for theoretical reasons.
There are certain projects within conceptual poetry and language poetry that I really value because of the sound, though. In particular,
Oh, yeah.
sound poetry is really interesting, but also one of the reasons it's important to hear or read poetry with your ears also is because poetry communicates outside of language and it communicates with sound. It's one of the coolest things to me about poetry is it's able to communicate with sound. There are times when I have read poems and I don't know what that is going on. I'm like, I don't know what just happened. At that point, and I find this with my students too, when they have to write about a poem, they're like, I don't get it, I don't connect to it, I don't understand what all these poetic devices, how they come together or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, well, what does this sound like? Why don't you write about the sound? And that's often like the easiest place for students to begin, in particular my non-native English speakers. Right? They can tap into it so quickly if they're thinking about sound or something visual about it. Like, this is what it looks like on the page. I'm going to write about what this poem looks like on the page because I don't know what it means. And then in a way, you're figuring out not what the poem means, but how it means, how it makes meaning, right? With language or outside of language. But that question of how does a poem make meaning or how it means is so important, rather than just like, what does it mean, right?
You don't leave a jazz concert or classical concert, you don't leave a music event thinking, that was great, but what did it mean? You don't have that experience. And some of the best poets that I'm attracted to, they require some work in figuring out how their mind works before you fall in. When I first started reading Nate Mackey, I had to put it down.
Totally
I wasn't
get
ready
that.
for it.
Yeah.
Like, I know this is good. People who I respect say this is good, but I can't get into it. This is work to understand,
Yeah.
or to begin to figure out what he's doing. And then I really went to work on his book, Splay Anthem. I had a chance to interview him. And when I got his next book, it was easier because I had some sense of his rhythms and how his mind worked. And it was like his work and others like him, Charles Olson I put in there and a few others, requires, it's not like he's going to let anyone in the house. You knock on the door and sorry, you might be a solicitor or something like that. But if you do enough work and you pay enough dues with that, there'll be a falling into it that's really beautiful, because a lot of art that you can get right away it's
You're
gone.
done with it.
Yeah, you're done,
You're
with,
done with it.
Even The Simpsons,
Yeah.
you can watch that a third time and see little things in the corner and say, wait a minute, I didn't get that the first time.
Yeah.
So the best art is multidimensional, which means sometimes it's going to take a little more work to get into it before you do. And if there's a good enough commitment, and I think always hearing the poem in terms of the
Yeah.
traditions that we're interested in, always hearing the poem adds something to it. So.
One of the books that I had this experiment that I wanted to do with was with Ezra Pound's cantos, and scholars love the cantos because there's so many references in there, and there's so much to mine for scholarship and write about in the cantos. And also people find them extremely difficult. But what I was interested in after rejecting, I'm not going to go read that, whatever everyone's reading that, I'm not reading that. I read this quote by Duncan, and he said that when he first read the cantos, he felt possessed by its rhythms, just really possessed. And I was like, that is something I've never heard anyone say about the cantos. I want to know about that. So I decided, and I don't recommend this to anyone, to read the entire cantos in 48 hours without stopping, except for water and bathroom breaks and a sandwich here or there. And I did, because I wanted to get a sense of that rhythmic possession, because people, especially in scholarship, were always talking about the references and the little networks of references in his work. And I did. I have no idea what they're about. Some of them I do. I've done some scholarship, but like at that time, I had no idea what was going on, but I could hear things, and I got that sense of possession after about 6 hours into it. I was like, I feel the possession now. I'm in it, and it was really interesting. It's very interesting to have a completely different experience of the cantos than many of my colleagues do. They're still talking about this reference and that reference. Here's this one about Asia that no one was talking about when he wrote it, and I'm like, yeah, let's talk about possession and what it sounds like. And they're like, what it sounds like?
Well, I take a different tack. I sympathize with the student who is given a poem, says, I can't figure out this poem. I don't know what it's about, or objects to literary devices, etc. So when I have taught poetry, I've tried to give the students, the poets, who write in the simplest, clearest language. And the three that I come to my mind are William Blake's Songs of Experience and Innocence, Emily Dickinson, and William Carlos Williams. And I defy people to take poems of any of those poets, most of the poems of those poets, not Blake's extremely complex prophetic books, but just poems like London, in the Songs of Experience, and say that they don't understand it. I mean, you can't not understand it. It speaks to you in a line of Marianne Moore's. She said, she referred to plain American that even cats and dogs can understand.
I am going to disagree with this on
I
a
know.
cross-cultural
I
level.
know.
Yeah, only because like culturally, this isn't always true. And like in the teaching scope that I have now, so many international students, plain American English is not going to cut it.
Right.
Sometimes there's just that distance that they're still grasping English. So it's like, and then there are students of color that I have that they're like, why are we reading this? I feel no connection to this whatsoever. And I don't know why is it talking about a lamb? Like, who cares about this lamb? And so I feel like on a cross-cultural level, I don't necessarily think that that's always possible to find something that's so like cut and clear. But since we were talking about Richard Brautigan, one poem that I do love by him is his Xerox candy bar poem. It's just like, it's something like, candy bar, you're just a copy of all the other candy bars I've ever eaten, right?
Yeah.
And that's something people can generally understand. I think his poems are very much like that, and that they can cut across these boundaries. And part of the reason that something like that does it is because it deals with the Xerox machine, which is something a lot of people used to be able to understand, right? Like when Xerox machines were actually being used, and they still are, right? But they've been fading away. And as long as you could like understand what a candy bar was and a Xerox machine was, then you could like enter the poem that way. So it was like dependent on these very ordinary devices in the world, or things in the world. I would call candy bars a vice, really.
Yeah.
Well, simple poems that are easy to understand don't have to be in English.
Yeah.
You read Poe's Chinese poems, you read Japanese haiku,
Yeah.
you read La Fontaine's fables. But I think I still sympathize with the idea of with the student who is faced with something that he's told is a poem, that he or she is told is a poem, and says, "What am I to make of this?"
Yeah.
That it is the instructor's responsibility to answer that question somehow for that student.
Eventually.
Eventually, yes.
Other questions? We'll take one more before we kind of take a break, and informally we can continue the conversation. I know somebody has one. It would be great to end on.
I think it's important for poets to have range too. So while I have those that have more neo-Barroco language, I also have these poems, short poems, American sentences, and some of them are very easy to get. And they're not even original, they're like found poems. Like, next to condom dispenser is written, "This is the worst gum ever." So right away, you have this mental picture of someone confusing what that is, that 50-cent thing in the bathroom. So I think having a range is also very important. It's something that I try and do. Even at a short reading, we had less than 5 minutes to read at the open mic last night. So I read an anagram, some American sentences, and then one of the latest things I'm working on. So range is also very important.
I have this experience teaching. Sometimes when a poem is so simple, sometimes readers are looking for something more in it. Right? There's another Richard Brautigan poem that talks about, I'm so depressed I feel like a turd sewed onto a garbage can lid. And I've had students write about this poem so many times. I think it's hilarious. It's very indicative. You're like, yeah, that's pretty sad, man. But then I have students, it's like they go through that so quickly. They're like, this is just kind of gross and sad, and I don't get it. And then why is he writing about this? And then they're like suddenly making these metaphors. They're like, I feel like he's talking about his relationship with God or something, or like maybe it's about like the larger world, and you're like, maybe it's just about, a turd being sewed onto a garbage can lid, and like, let's explore that. I know you don't want to explore the turd, but like, what's going on there? Like, work with the image that's there.
Well, do you want to explore
than
depression? He says Brautigan says the poem is about depression.
Yeah.
Maybe the idea of depression is something you don't want to explore. So I'll give you an image that you won't want to explore.
Yeah.
And then when you know how he ended up in Bolinas putting a gun to his head, then it has a little more depth to it,
Yeah.
because his depression was real. He was so poor that his mother was sifting their flour in their house to get the rat shit out of it, and made flour and water pancakes. And he was so poor, he went to the police station and started throwing rocks at the police station so they would arrest him, put him in jail, and he'd have something to eat. And instead of doing that, they put him in jail, but they also put him in the psych ward and gave him electroshock therapy, which screwed him up for the rest of his life. So a depression that real, that someone will take their own life, as evidenced by something like this, you begin to get some sense of where he was coming from in terms of his personal mythology. And it's really poignant. Really poignant.
Well, any other questions or comments? I'm going to get on camera. Anyway, thank you for being here today and for watching online. And help yourself to some refreshments in the back. And stick around and talk to these guys if you have some more questions one-on-one you want to talk to them about. Or take a look at Paul's book or the books they have here. Anyway, but thank you very much. Let's give them a hand. And their chocolate chip cookies.
Oh, yeah.
Stop this now.
Went quick.
Oh
Almost an hour and a half. I thought we could keep it to an hour for just only questions.
Yeah.